Hello everyone, I'm Professor Paul Carrier of the Western Michigan University Thomas M. Cooley Law School, and what I would like to do is to provide some information that should be helpful as you work through the materials from the end of Class 4, which we'll address up front, and then for the remainder of Class 5, the materials on anticipatory repudiation. Anticipatory repudiation is very, very important, but not particularly complicated and also not particularly extensive with regard to the things that you need to memorize and be able to work with. And so that hopefully justifies the fact that we're giving it 2 hours of a 3-hour class. And then before we go to that, let's pick up a little bit more on conditions, as I mentioned last time. 2 quick things. First, as you recall, the best way to make students participate in class is to say something wrong. I noticed at the end of last prequel, the last video, that I started talking about a rejection and then moved into revocation. It was for that last case, Colonial Dodge, the one with the bad spare tire. That is a 2608 revocation case, not a 2601 rejection case. Okay. Secondly, through the materials for last week's video, and in the past I've used the term breacher, which spell check tells me is not a real word. Okay, so I say breacher, that's fine for me, but in the real world you would probably say non-breaching party. Okay? Now, going back to conditions, when you have conditions and you have the somewhat harsh reality of forfeiture, where a condition is honored, you see the courts try to find ways around it, and courts in different jurisdictions, and sometimes even the same jurisdiction, might have 5, 7, 8 different ways of avoiding forfeiture. Okay, and some is straight up. This allows forfeiture, we will not do that. End of story. Other courts take another route. Well, yes, but you waived it. Well, we've stopped it. Well, those are 2 dependent promises, and so you can't get the one without doing the other. So you argue now you have the right to create a forfeiture, but the answer is that you can't because some obligation that you have to the other side is not finished, so theirs is not in breach, or not the same way. And so there are quite a few ways around it, which is unfortunate because it makes it more difficult to understand. And in fact, your authors discuss that very point on a note which comes from an article by Robert Childress, Conditions in the Law of Contracts, from the New York University Law Review. I don't know which page it is, but it's in the materials for week 5, just after, no, maybe it's week 4, just after the Inman case. And that might be worth taking a look at because it's pretty interesting. So you get a sense of why, if you're confused, it is in fact confusing. Last time we talked about implied conditions, implying the dependence of obligations, where one side argues independence, we don't have to pay, the other side argues it is dependent, we don't have to pay until the other side has met its part of the bargain. Okay, you remember the lease agreement for the gas station and the requirements contract, which were different, and the court treated those as dependent, as an example. We also discussed in several different factual scenarios the concept of substantial performance. Remember, substantial performance is a common law concept, and it has very little room for treatment in the UCC. Okay, with regard to Article 2, 2601, the right to reject a non-conforming tender, we don't worry about substantial performance. It's conforming or it's not, right? And you remember we talked earlier about those burdens when you're trying to reject, and we covered that to some degree in Contracts 1 as well. Then there's 2608, which is the ability to revoke an acceptance for something that's somewhat hard to find. And again, that is not an area where a court can apply the substantial performance doctrine. That is a little closer, however, because now the burden to revoke acceptance is actually on the buyer who's trying to revoke acceptance, and that burden has been shifted now onto the buyer. And it has to be a substantial impairment of the value of the contract and not just a nonconformity with the terms and conditions of the contract. And so, to be honest, it gets a little bit closer to what you've seen in common law as the material breach / substantial performance doctrine. Not quite. Do keep in mind, however, that with regard to installment contracts, the breach of one installment, if it's not a very big deal, is a breach only of that installment and not the entire contract. Okay? Which is basically an Article 2 validation of the substantial performance idea. Okay? This week now, let's get to this week's materials, which I'm trying to catch up because we couldn't fit them all in week 4. Other ways that courts get around enforcing conditions that lead to forfeiture. The court might imply a duty to cooperate or a duty of good faith. Yes, the other side forfeits if they don't finish painting the garage. However, you have a duty to help them paint the garage. If you lock them out and don't let them work on your land, you've breached your duty to cooperate, and your breach of a duty to cooperate or a duty to act in good faith excuses their duty to fully fulfill a condition which would give you the right to claim a forfeiture. The example there was some woman who was having some work done in her house with contractors. Note, with contractors, it was common law, not UCC. At some point, she locked them out. They couldn't fix it. And then when she had the work done by somebody else, she tried not to pay the first contractor. And the first contractor argued, well, but she locked us out, and we didn't have the ability to go in and fix it. Sure, we didn't do it right, but we would have had she not locked us out. And the court implied a duty of the woman to cooperate, failure of which did not allow her to enforce the condition of the requirement of full and perfect performance under the circumstances. And so she was not allowed to argue that she didn't have to pay at least something to the other contractor. Let's see now. Well, interpretation of a condition as not requiring forfeiture but something else. That's a little bit vague. Hopefully I'll talk about it in more detail in class, and that'll come from the Burger King case. There's an example cutting the other way, an ability to avoid forfeiture, but the court in fact does fine for a forfeiture, and that's the Inman case, where we had a person who signed a contract, and the employment agreement included the fact that he was supposed to notify the company if he thought that there was some kind of unfair termination of his employment. And rather than file that notice, he simply filed a claim. And it was file a notice within 30 days and do not file a claim within 6 months of the termination. And the idea there is, tell us that you were unfairly terminated and we'll look into it. Don't file a lawsuit for 6 months, because once you file a lawsuit, we become defendants and we lose any wiggle room. So file on time, don't file a lawsuit for 6 months, and maybe we can work things out without having to go through the court system, right? And that is actually not necessarily a bad idea. Well, the person didn't file this notice of wrongful termination. He brought the case in time, and he argued, well, my filing of the lawsuit for wrongful termination works the exact same way as giving the company notice that I was wrongfully terminated. Okay? Problem there was, filing the lawsuit also takes away the 6 months of negotiation because the parties were automatically put into a litigious situation. The court, somewhat harshly, but perhaps validly, decided that that was in fact a condition, and the failure to honor the condition about giving notice to the company before filing a lawsuit and also giving it within the 1 month period, the failure to do that was a breach of condition, and that removed the duty of the defendant, the car company, to go any further. Okay, so there you see the forfeiture this guy might go through because he now loses his claim to be brought back in. that is harsh, and yet public policy, at least to that court, was better served by honoring or enforcing the condition rather than finding some bizarre way around it when the person did not properly follow the steps that the condition would have required. Okay? There's the concept of waiver. We see that best in the PHH Mortgage Corporation case. If you're told to do something a certain way and you do not, and yet the way you do it has been accepted over time, should be fine then, and then the party has waived its duty or its ability to treat that as a binding condition that leads to forfeiture. We may talk about elections and impossibility if time permits. Now anticipatory repudiation. If the other party gives reasonable belief or, basically unequivocal statement of repudiation, allows the non-breaching party to treat it as breach right away and sue and cover or do whatever it requires or whatever it should be doing in the case of breach. Or, at the non-breaching party's option, it can wait and give the quote-unquote breaching party the chance to retract. The breaching party can then retract unless the non-breaching party has in fact relied on the repudiation, for example, by selling to a new buyer or buying cover from a new source, I should say. Okay? Keep in mind the equivocability. That's not a word, by the way. The repudiation has to be unequivocal, right? If it's, I'm not sure I can perform, the non-breaching party had better not treat it as a repudiation. Okay? I may not be able to perform is not I will not and cannot perform. And so if the non-breaching party treats it as repudiation and pulls the trigger too quickly, that becomes the breach. Okay? So, clear repudiation, treat it as breach, or wait at the non-breaching party's option. Not so sure, you had better ask first. Because if you move too quickly and the breach was equivocal, then you're treating it as a repudiation, in fact, becomes the breach. Okay? So common law and UCC allows the non-breaching party who is uncertain to go out and seek a clarification on whether there is or will not be a repudiation. Okay? At common law, you can simply make a request. It can be oral, by the way. Did you mean you can't perform, or are you saying you still will, or probably can? I need to know that so I can either wait or treat it as breach, but you must be clear. And then if the other party hears that request and doesn't say anything, then the non-breaching party can in fact treat the non-answer as a repudiation. Okay? And the timing of that request and the answer is a little bit flexible. You look at the facts and circumstances and how long it should be. If you look at UCC, Article 2-610 has the same idea for repudiation. It has to be unequivocal. The non-breaching party can either treat it as breach and act right away. It can suspend its performance, of course. It can treat it as breach and sue for damages right away. Or, if it chooses, it can wait to give the quote-unquote breaching party the chance to retract that breach. Okay? 2-611 of the UCC covers the ability to retract repudiation, which is bounded, however, by the fact that if the non-breaching party has relied on a repudiation and acted differently, then the retraction is not effective. You can't retract once the other party has relied on your repudiation. It would not be fair. UCC, with regard to uncertainty of a potential repudiation, has 2-609, the right to request adequate assurances. Right? So if a party is nervous about the other party's ability to perform, but not clear on a repudiation, it can send in writing a request. And that writing should be received, returned within a reasonable time, not to exceed 30 days. Failure of the allegedly, this written request, right, on whether or not the party can perform. I think I just lost my train of thought. Let me go forward. If the party receives that request and doesn't answer, it is treated as a repudiation. If the answer doesn't come within a reasonable time, not to exceed 30 days. It has to be in writing. One trick that you might see on a multiple choice question on the bar exam someday, with regard to the request for adequate assurances, I think this is subsection 2 of 609. If that request is made between merchants, but by a merchant, then the request has to be based on a commercially reasonable belief that the other party may be breaching. You can't pull it out of your hat because you're nervous. You have to have some demonstrable reason for worry, and that's why you send the written request for further assurances. There are some very interesting cases that we'll cover in class, but we'll get there in just another day or two. Thank you.